So tonight, what we're doing tonight, I want to learn Leilu Nishmat Yakir Teitelbaum, Hashem Yikom Damo, and Lahavda Ben Chaim L'Chaim, Refuah Shlema to Rabbi Yishai Engelman, who Baruch Hashem has shown some significant improvement since this morning or since yesterday evening. It seems like, every day I write myself a little note before class who to say it, Leilu Nishmat, or Leilu for Refuah Shlema. It's out of control. We need some changes. We need something to happen big time. I've had endless numbers of people saying to me, what else can happen? Not what else can happen, but what else does Hashem want from us, and what should happen, and what should we do? So I'm trying in my head to come up with some ideas to talk about. But just as a reminder, for those of you who come to the Tefillah class, which I had to postpone because of the Shiva and everything else, it's tomorrow night, Bezrat Hashem, at 7 o'clock, and we're going to be talking about a topic that fits in with this whole subject, which will be about Olam Haba, Tchiyat HaMetim, Gan Eden, and all the different opinions of which no one knows for sure. So that's always a wonderful thing. Okay, we are in the middle talking about the Ibn Ezra. We'll talk a little bit more about him. Something I wanted to check on my screen before, if I needed this. Yeah. Okay, what I want to do before we start is to kind of just give you a little bit of a preview. We'll go to share. Just for a minute here. Move this over. Make it big. We are in the middle of talking about the Ibn Ezra, and I said after that we're going to talk about the Rambam. The truth is that we can't really start with the Rambam until we talk about two other people. Oh, I spelled Yitzchak wrong. Sorry. We have to talk about two people, which some of you may know of, some may not. Yitzchak Alfasi, also known as the Rif, and the Rosh Rabbeinu Asher. Each one could be literally an hour and a half, 2 hours. I'm going to do just a few minutes on each of them tonight, and then a little intro, if we get to it, on the Rambam. The reason that's the case is, imagine you walk into class in college, and you're going to take a class in calculus. I've never taken calculus. And the first day, the teacher said, okay, we're going to start calculus, but let's review a little bit of algebra, and let's review some trig, and let's review some geometry, and then we're going to get into calculus. And you never took trig, calculus, algebra. You wouldn't understand the basis of what you're talking about here. The truth is that when you talk about the Rambam, you need to know a little bit about these other two people, because they are the ones who will influence all of his writing. And the difference between what we're doing now about Ibn Ezra and all those we've talked about so far in the Golden Age of Spain, the big difference is going to come when we move into the Rif, or Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi. I'll explain what the split is going to be. It's not about Ashkenazi, Sfarad. Well, it is a little bit, not. You'll see when we get to it. So look, we're going to go back now. We're going to talk about Ibn Ezra and some more information about his life. So remember, here's a great word for you if you don't know it, peripatetic. Peripatetic is someone who likes to travel and get around. So he was peripatetic, not necessarily by his own desire. Sometimes it was forced, sometimes it was in order to do something proactive for a community. But in 1152, he moves to northern France. And it is there that he writes a new Perush on Torah. It was called Perush HaAroch, which means the long commentary. And yes, there was a short commentary also that he wrote. It was so well received that it received the respect of some very big time Talmidei Chachamim, including Rabbeinu Tam, the Rashbam. These are grandsons of Rashi. Remember, those are Ashkenazim, and we're going to get to that part of the world. But right now, he's in France, so this is the part of the background to Rashi's future generations. So these great Gedolim, the Rabbeinu Tam and Rashbam, and if you don't know who they are, that's fine for now. It's massive. The approbations he gets for what he writes. He goes back to England, he goes to Spain, and he's there until his death in 1164. So that's kind of like to round off his life a little bit, but we need to also understand more about his writings, because his writings had a major impact, have to this day made a major impact in the Torah world. Now you'll notice, and it's kind of tipping my hand a little bit here, is that none of these groups, or these people I've spoken about so far, have been influential when it comes to halacha. They've been mostly in writing, in commentaries, in poetry, piyutim, some other areas, but not necessarily in halacha. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind. And we still will not see Ibn Ezra as being someone who's the halachist person. He composed, Ibn Ezra, over a dozen books, over 1,000 poems, piyutim and shirim, mathematical and biblical riddles, and all kinds of exercises, mind exercises. He was way ahead of his time. If you have a Chumash at home that has the commentary of the Ibn Ezra, and if you have a Mikrot Gedolot, you will have the commentary of the Ibn Ezra. For every parasha, he gives a little bit of like a one-line poem, 1-2 lines, sometimes less, that has something to do with parasha. It's like an introduction. His commentary is vast. His knowledge is vast. He was a believing Jew who was passionate about his Judaism and about the Torah, the keeping Torah, and he influenced commentary on Torah almost as much as Rashi. There's no question, hands down, that Rashi is the #1 commentary in Tanakh and beyond, including the Talmud. And when we get to Rashi, we'll understand why, what was his greatness. But he wrote commentary, this is talking about Ibn Ezra, on the Tanakh, on Torah, the 5 Megillot, Yeshayahu, Treyasar, Tehillim, Iyov, Daniel, and he seems to have written, because he makes reference to his commentaries in certain other Svarim of Tanakh, that he's written on others, but they haven't been found. Maybe one day we'll find it. I mentioned before he wrote the Pirush HaAroch and the Pirush HaKatzar, the long and the short commentaries on Torah. The short one, the only thing that evidently still exists, is the commentary on Sefer Breshit, some, and on Sefer Shmot. But otherwise, what we have in our Mikrot Gedolot are the works of his Perush HaAroch, the long Perush. The Perush HaAroch, yes. The problem is, when it comes to Ibn Ezra, it's sometimes very difficult to comprehend what he's trying to tell us. Now, I'm going to take a step back for a second. I'm going to give you a true story. I'll leave the name of the Rav out of the story. There was a rabbi, great rabbi in New York City many years ago, whose daughter was eligible for marriage. And he was talking to a prospective future son-in-law to talk to him. And Toch Kedei, in the middle, the son-in-law wanting to, not even to impress his future father-in-law or potential future father-in-law, but he wants to talk in Torah. And he starts to quote the Meshech Chochmah from Dvinsk. He starts to explain something, and he says, wait, the Rav says, wait. You understand the Meshech Chochmah? Yeah. He said, really? He says, then you're perfect for my daughter. What was his point? In order to understand the Meshech Chochmah, who's going to come centuries later after this time period, in order to learn Meshech Chochmah, you have to already know what he's referring to. So, for example, let's say, for instance, I'm making this up now. He didn't write this. But he says, as on the pasuk, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And he says the following. He says like this. Again, I'm making this up. He didn't say this. It's because that railing fell off. It was when it happened when it was blue. What? Like what exactly was he doing when he wrote those words? Meaning, you have to understand his point of reference already. When he's making references to stuff he's assuming you know before you open his book. It makes it very difficult to understand. Now, the Ibn Ezra, again, now going back to our time period, the late 12th century, is not as difficult because, but he does make some comments sometimes that are very difficult to understand. And there's reasons for that. I'll come to in a minute. But where he is huge in his commentaries, if you ever have a question when it comes to grammar, say, why does the pasuk use this word, or what does this word mean, and what's the grammatical context, that he's your go-to person. It's beyond the scope of this particular type of class, but you can take all these different people who are commentaries on the Torah, whether it's Rashi, Ibn Ezra, all of them, Ramban, they all have a certain approach that you'll find that goes throughout all of their commentary. So again, the Ramban doesn't spend a lot of time on dikduk, on grammar. Ibn Ezra does a tremendous amount of it. Rashi does some as well. So let's go back to Ibn Ezra. Why is it that his commentary is so difficult to understand sometimes? Sometimes very, very clear. And sometimes just the 3 or 4 words, and you have absolutely no idea what he's saying. So there are 3 possible reasons for this that I came across. Number one, that there actually were written, they were longer than this, and they were summaries of lectures that he gave. So for example, if I would give a 1-hour lecture on a pasuk, and then to summarize, like, but okay, here's just a few words, and from that you should be able to recall what I said. But the people who weren't at the lecture would need to, the Torah Sheba'al Peh, you need to explain what's going on. So that is one way it could make it a little bit difficult to understand everything he's saying. That's one. Possibly the second way, he was one of the first commentators in the to write in Spain, to write in Hebrew. Many wrote in Arabic or in Spanish, especially Spanish, but he's the first one to write in Hebrew. And so therefore, he sometimes had to coin new phrases, new expressions that no one knew. So don't ask the background to this, but when we were growing up, my brother and I had a word we made up. And I don't remember exactly in what context, but we just made up a word, Mephiseldorf and Dorsen. It was like a ridiculous, and I still remember this after all these years. We probably started when I was like 5, 6 years, no, old, 7, 8 years old. So I use it, but imagine I start using that in a lecture or in some, and if you don't have no idea what I'm talking about, then you're lost. So he did have to come up with certain new words. Again, remember, he was a grammarian. He was very much into grammar and into Hebrew, and therefore building a new word was not unusual for him. And not only that, was very common in the Middle Ages. I've done it only once in writing piyutim and writing liturgical poetry. It just sounds too weird to say it in English. To make up a word that doesn't really exist. I've only done it once, and I got permission, so to speak, from someone who helps me when he checks my work. So it works. This is not a real word, but it worked in the context. But he did it a lot because there were words that didn't yet really exist. And finally, some believe that what Ibn Ezra wrote, he felt should be kind of a code, like kept secret. Like he really wanted only Talmidei Chachamim to know what he was writing, the very smart individuals, because he felt that they needed to keep the higher tier of individuals to understand Torah, what he wanted to teach, and he would leave others to comment at a different level. So those are possible. No one knows for sure. I guess we'll ask him at Tchiyat HaMetim, but no one knows for sure exactly why he wrote sometimes in a much more confusing or difficult way to understand. Now, you don't want to walk away from this class and say, I'm never going to open up the Ibn Ezra now. Don't ever say something like that, because there's plenty he wrote you'll be able to understand. There's also translations of what he wrote. And besides which, it's also good to challenge your mind. It's very good and very helpful. He also wrote, as I said, a introduction in rhyme to, first he wrote a whole introduction to the Torah. If you open up a Mikrot Gedolot, Chumash, you think that Mikrot Gedolot is modern. This goes back hundreds of years. The Mikrot Gedolot didn't have as many commentaries in it as we do today, but it goes back, I think, at least to the 1700s. It could be earlier. I don't remember. In the beginning, in Sefer Bereshit, you'll have long introductions to Ramban, Ibn Ezra, Kli Yakar. They all have introductions, and then some of them, like I say, Ibn Ezra will give an introduction in every parsha with some different, like a little bit of a statement that's a poem. He also was very critical of some of the earlier commentaries that were written on Chumash. So we have to understand, in order to understand how that worked, we need to take a little bit of an understanding of the different approaches from some other scholars. And some maybe you've never even heard of. There was a yeshiva in Spain, whose heads were Reb Shmuel ben, I wrote this down because I would never remember these names. Shmuel ben Chofni, Yitzchak HaYisraeli, and the third one you know is Sadia Gaon. They wove in, I don't know how you say it, philosophy into their commentaries on Torah. Now, Ibn Ezra had no problem with external type of wisdom. He was fine with that. But his main argument was he wanted us to understand Pshat. He wanted us to understand the straight commentary of the Torah. What is the Torah trying to tell us? You don't need to weave in any of your philosophy. So he was dead set against people who included philosophical approaches within their commentaries. Doesn't mean that they were wrong. Doesn't mean they're wrong. That was a different approach. That's how he said, I don't want that. I want, so I'll give you an example that is similar, but not the same thing. Because it's not philosophical, it has to do with Midrash. And I think I may have mentioned this somewhere along the way in some classes in the last few years. If you have kids or grandkids that have grown up in the Jewish day school system and in Chutz La'aretz, somewhat here also, especially in Chutz La'aretz, you'll find that when they come home before Shabbat on Parashat Shemot, they very often will come home with a drawing that has a piece of paper and a hand, like a drawing of a hand attached to that piece of paper that can move around. And you say, what is that? So you say, well, it says in the Torah that when Bat Paro, the daughter of Paro, saw a basket in the water, which we know is Moshe Rabbeinu, it says, Vatishlachet amata. She sent out her maidservant to take the baby. But that's the Pashut Pshat, that's what the Pasuk means. But Rashi says that there's a Midrash. It says, Vatishlachet amata. The amma is your arm. From here to, you talk about there's 20 amot and 5 amot. So the middle finger in Hebrew is called the amma, because an amma is from your elbow to the end of your middle finger. Vatishlachet amata, according to Midrash, also can mean she overstretched her arm farther than she could ever reach. Naturally, it's stretched out in a miraculous fashion to bring the basket back in. Now, that's a beautiful Midrash, and you can learn so much from that about overextending yourself in a good way. But the problem is that kids come home from school, and I've actually done this experiment, and I asked them, what does that pasuk mean? I'm not talking about, 2-year-olds, but, a little bit older, maybe 8, 9 years old. And almost every single one says that it means that her arm stretched out way, way out. Well, that's very nice, but that's a Midrash, and not to minimize Midrash. Midrash Haggadah is important, but it's not Pshat. Pshat means, the meaning of the pasuk is, she sent her maidservant, same word, Aleph, Mem, Hey, Amma. So this is a similar argument that the Ibn Ezra had with those who wanted to include philosophy into their explanation of the Torah. He says, I'm not interested in that. Don't give me your philosophical stuff. I want Pshat. I want people, when they read commentary, to understand what Hashem is trying to tell us in the pasuk. And don't expand on it, don't explore philosophy. He would go crazy today, what's called biblical criticism, which is not a good thing, but that's not for tonight. There's another way that, another thing that he was also very much against. Remember, we talked about the Karaites a few weeks back. They denied, just as a reminder in one sentence, they denied the authenticity of the oral law of Torah Shabbat Peh. He fights against the Karaites in his commentary with all of his strength. He works hard to prove that there are many, many mitzvot that cannot be understood without Misorah, without the Chachamim's input as to what they meant. So that's another approach that he tried to work against something. He worked against philosophical introduction into explanations or commentaries. He worked against the Karaites. And the third way was those who used allegories, mishalim, parables, in order to interpret a pasuk. He basically said that until there's really a need to use an allegory, don't use it. It's not necessary. If you want to try to explain the pasuk, basically, I'm paraphrasing because he didn't say it exactly like this. Don't start inserting into your commentary on Torah all these allegories. A person can come up with certain things on their own, but it is not the way of metaphors that need to be expanded upon. And the other way had to do with homiletics. What's homiletics? Kind of, again, midrashic approach to something. He said there's no reason to start. I guess he would be against what, like, for example, what Rashi brought in, this particular midrash. He said there's no reason to reinvent the wheel. There are midrashim out there. Again, he's going on the assumption that the people he's coming in contact with have some level of education, and they would be able to open up a book of midrashim. Keep in mind again, I think it's very important. I said it last week, I probably said it the week before, and I'm going to keep saying it until we get to about the 1500s. There is no printing press yet. Everything is handwritten, so you have to remember that. His own interpretive path uses a metaphor very rarely. He's very much straight to the point. Okay. Ad Kan, up to this point, we've discussed now the Ibn Ezra. We've learned about Yehuda Levi. We've learned about a number of other individuals of the golden age of Spain. And in order to now move to the next major event, major player, i.e. the Rambam, we need some introduction. And that introduction...
Rabbi, before you move on, where are these people buried? Just in case we're ever visiting places.
Okay, so he's buried in the Ibn Ezra is buried in Spain. What I'll do, if you would remind me, please, I will send out a little note saying where each one of these individuals is buried. Okay.
Sure.
Okay. Sure. Thank you. I appreciate that. We know, like I'm some big genius. The Rambam's buried in Tveria. For those who've never been to his kever, you're missing something very big. But if you haven't been to his kever in the last maybe 2 years, it doesn't look anything like you remember it. It's been changed radically, been made very fancy, whatever. But yeah, thank you, Danny. I'll make sure to send it out if you remind me. Until now, and I said this just a few minutes ago, we've been talking about these people who've had an influence till today in many ways. We saw about, let's go back to the Gaonim. They have an influence today when it comes to Shelot and Chuvot and all these different halachic decisions. We've had when it comes to the Golden Age of Spain, had to do with commentaries, it had to do with poems, had to do with Piyutim, all these things. Donish Ibn Labrat, if you're singing Zmiot on Shabbat, very likely you're singing some of his words. The next two people before the Rambam, it's a very, very different reason we want to learn about them. If you recall, we talked about the Mishnah, which was finished in approximately year 200 of the Common Era. We talked about the Gemara, Talmud, which is finished in approximately year 500 of the Common Era. And we're already up to almost the 1200s. And from then, from about 500 till the 1200s, so I'm talking 7 centuries, there is no other real book. I shouldn't say up to the 1200s. We're going to come into about the 1100s now. No real book that's come out of what we would call today halacha. There's no halacha book. There are many books that have been put out by the Gaonim with questions and answers, but as far as a book to look up a question in halacha, how do you make a sukkah? What is tefillin made from? It's not yet really out there. He said, wait a minute, I got Gemara. I could take out a Gemara. If I want to look in Gemara and Chulin, I could start looking up, I think it's Chulin, that talks about tefillin, how they're made. If I want to learn about halachot of the Megillah, I'll look in Masechet Megillah. Okay, very nice. If you have the ability, first, if you have a set of Gemara, that's first of all. Second of all, you have to be able to understand it. It wasn't necessarily, we think that sometimes, like all the people, for example, in Europe, Shtetl, they were all poor and they ate dirt for supper and for breakfast. Now, we tend to make up these pictures in our mind of what everyone was like. If you ask ArtScroll, everyone who died in the Holocaust was Orthodox and religious and had payas. It's a little bit exaggeration. But at this time, not everyone was so well versed in Torah. And we've seen that in the approach of some of these people we've met already. So we still don't have anything that's giving us halacha. So here's where we're going to start to divert to the world of halacha, of Jewish law. We'll talk about Alfasi, the Rif. We'll talk about the Rosh. We're going to talk then about the Rambam. And eventually we're going to talk about the Tur, the Shulchan Aruch. There's all these massive, massive things that all you need to do is to walk into any Jewish home and something of everyone I'm talking about now will be on your shelf. So I don't have a copy of anything with the Rif. I've never heard of the Rosh. Hang on, you actually do know about these things if you don't even realize So we're going to talk about Rav Yitzchak ben Yaakov Alfasi, also known as the Rif or Alfasi. Why is he called Alfasi? We'll see in a minute. He's in Spain, and he's probably best known more than anything else for being the first code of Jewish law in Jewish history. Again, you're going to say, I've never seen his books. Okay. So first, let's learn a little about who he was. He's born in Algeria. He learns and studies in Tunisia. And he learned with a man named Hananel ben Hushiel, who I think we mentioned once, but right now it's not, for our discussion, it's not as important. But he trained Alfasi, trained the Rif, to start to use his mental acuity to deduce and clarify halacha, the Talmud. What does that mean? His teacher gave him an idea that Alfasi ends up conceiving of and magnifying. Let me see if I can do this here. I'm gonna. If you get dizzy looking at a screen when things are moving, so don't look at the screen for a minute. Okay. You will take a look at and move this stuff out of the way. Okay. You see this bottom shelf of my bookcase there. See all those maroon colored books, okay? That's a set of Talmud on the bottom shelf. It actually belonged to my Zadie little shelf, okay? So it's made up of 20 volumes, and that's the Gemara. Now, there are 2,000, as you know, in Talmud, 2,711 pages in the Gemara. That's how we know the Daf Yomi takes 7.5 years to go through the entire Talmud. In the Talmud, as we talked about a number of months back, it's filled with halacha, history, science, math, all kinds of things. Everything you can imagine, almost every single topic you can imagine is covered in there. But where's the halacha? I mean, if I start to look for something, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, I know that there's the topic of a sukkah that's circular. It's round. Is it kosher, not kosher? What's the size have to be? What's the minimum dimension? So I know it's covered in Masechet Sukkah, and I start flipping pages and looking for it, but there's no organizational or organized halacha book yet. Along comes the Rif, Rabbeinu Alfasi, or Yitzchak Alfasi, and he decides to compile a comprehensive work of the conclusions of the Gemara. The conclusions of the Gemara. What does that mean? It took him 10 years sitting day and night. He lived in his father-in-law's attic. If you think that's strange, I'll tell you about another person in a second. He lived in his father-in-law's attic, writing for 10 consecutive years, where he synthesized out of the Gemara all the different halachic decisions, and he put them into print. If you have a Gemara in your home, you will notice that if you turn to the very back of the book of almost any volume, you will see the Rif. Sometimes you're going to see the Ran, and sometimes Mahar, and you're going to see some others in the Rush, who we're going to talk about in a minute. But the Rif is the first one to put into some semblance of order. It's not by, okay, we're going to look up Hilchot Sukkah, and we're going to look up Hilchot Rosh Hashanah. It's not that. But what it is I know that I can turn to the back of Masechet Sukkah, and all the discussions that took place in the Gemara that had to do with halacha and all the conclusions, he gives you all the conclusions. He doesn't give you the back and forth. There's no rabbi, this said this, and rabbi, just tachlis, what did we learn? And that was the beauty of his work. Now, I mentioned that you think that's strange that he stayed for 10 years in his father-in-law's attic writing. So if you go into the old city in Yerushalayim, and you walk down the street of Rehov Or HaChaim, there's a shul that's there. I'm sure many of you know of it. It's the original shul that was there for centuries, was maintained by the Weinberg family, and they've had a family member has been like in charge of the gabbai, so to speak, of the shul for many years. I've davened there a few times on Shabbatot, and I've been in the old city. If you go there, you will see that there's a regular shul in Aron Kodesh, and if you look behind you or off to the side, looks to be a balcony. You'd think it's an Ezrat Nashim. but there's no way to get there. It's up like maybe 10, 12 feet off the ground. It's a balcony. The author of the Orach Chaim sat there for many, many years. I mean, he had a ladder, he'd go up and down, but he didn't come down unless he had to go to sleep, I guess, or bathroom or whatever it was. He literally wanted to seclude himself within the shul in order to write his commentary. The reason the road is named Rehov Orach Chaim is because of him. So if you have the opportunity to walk down into the old city, go into Shar Yafo, Jaffa Gate, you keep walking straight, and you'll hit a street called St. James. Great. Make a left on St. James and continue walking straight. You're going to come to kind of a steep road, or not a road, whatever, a walk area. That's Orach Chaim. And keep walking down, and on your right side, you're going to see the shul. If you ever get the chance, hop in there. It's fascinating to see that someone could sit up there secluded for I don't know, it wasn't years, I don't know how many years it was, but he did the same thing because he needed to focus and hyper focus, and he ends up writing one of the classic amazing commentaries of all the commentaries that exist on Torah. So he does this for halacha, but again, it's only becomes a stepping stone. We're going to see how that becomes a stepping stone. This is why I'm telling you, you can't understand the Rambam or the Shulchan Aruch or the Tur or any of these things without understanding the Rif first. So in 1045, he moves to Fez, hence the name Al-Fasi, meaning of Fez. That's why he gets the name Al-Fasi. And the community supports him so he can continue working on his Sefer Halachot. Many students from Morocco, where he was, come to study under his guidance. And one of his most famous students, now we went back a little bit in time, one of the most famous students is Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, who was, we talked about, the author of Kuzari, the author of many Piyutim and other things. He also taught somebody who I will not go into, who was called the Ri Migash, Yosef ibn Migash, who turns out to be the father, the teacher of Rabbi Maimon, who's the father and teacher of the Rambam. So there's a direct link, not just in a basis what the Rambam is going to write a short time later, but also in the transition and tradition and carrying on of education from one to the next, straight to the Rambam from the Rif. You have the Rif, who also taught the Ri Migash, who taught Rav Maimon, who taught the Rambam, who was his son. He stays in Fez for 40 years, and unfortunately, in the year 1088, two informers go to the government and say that he was a bad guy. They had some trumped up charges. They want to imprison him. This is a theme that repeats itself in the Middle Ages constantly, pops up again in the 1800s, 1900s, whether you're in Eastern Europe or you're in Russia. Nothing new under the sun, as Kohelet said, Shlomo said. So he decides to leave from Fez to run to, this is why he's part of the golden age of Spain, to El Andalus, i.e. Spain. He becomes eventually the head of the yeshiva in Cordoba. His major work, his magnum opus, is Halachot Harif, or Hilchot Harif, also again known as Ilfas. It's not on the entire Shas, not on the entire Talmud. It's mostly on Moed, Nashim, and Nezikin, meaning the 3 out of the 6 main ones that seem to be used most commonly for practical halacha. What does that mean? Chulin, which has to do with shafting animals and things like that, you would think it does have a lot of practical halacha. But there are other areas, Zvachim and Menachot. Oh, it's Menachot, by the way. I meant to say yes earlier. Well, maybe I said it right. Menachot is where the halachot of Tefillin are. That's what they are. Yeah, if I said it wrong before, sorry, I just don't remember. But the Moed, Nashim, and Nezikim, which have to do with holidays, it has to do with marriage and divorce, it has to do with damages and torts and all kinds of other stuff. Those are where he wrote mostly. He did write on Brachot and Chulin, because again, Chulin was very much necessary for him to tell us decisions with Gemara, and on Brachot. but not on most of the other tractates, some of the others, Gemaras. When he does give the halacha, he doesn't put it in different words and try to package it nicely. He tells you verbatim the conclusions of the Gemara. Now, for those of you who learn Gemara, you will know that sometimes the Gemara will say, the Hilchata Kit, the halacha goes like so-and-so. One that pops into my head, if you're familiar with Yehu Shalom Midat, if you're not, it's okay, it's fine, it's not for now. But at the end of this whole long 2.5-page discussion, it says, Hilchata Ki Abai V'yal Kigam. So the Gemara sometimes does tell you straight out who in the Beit Midrash in Bavel they decided, okay, in this case, this is the halacha. So of course, that's what's going to be quoted directly by the Rif. But other times, he's going to come up with methodology to decide, figure out what the Gemara's conclusion is, and he'll still come up with wording that's straight out of the Gemara. Now, how is it that his work is so critical? So I sort of mentioned that already. Number one, it becomes his kind of I don't like using this expression because it's so not Torah-based, but we're going to use it anyways. What's the difference between the Reader's Digest version of something and the full book? So Reader's Digest version gives you the critical parts of the story that you're reading, the books. You almost all, I'm sure, remember that the Reader's Digest, not the magazine itself, but would come out with a book. I don't know how it was, once a year, twice a year, which had inside of it 3 or 4 books, but in an abridged version. It's called, that's where you get the expression to give me the Reader's Digest version of something, meaning give me the abridged version. So in a sense, his digest, the Rif's Digest, is, again, the first book of Jewish law. It's still not yet attainable for looking something up easily, which then leads eventually to the Rambam, which becomes much more easy to look something up, and eventually to Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch. We will deal with Rabbi Yosef Karo in its proper time. The Rambam, not till next week, it looks like. But these 3 people, Rabbi Yosef Karo, Rambam, Rif, are the fundamental basis of what's called halacha, or Jewish law, code of Jewish law, or it becomes the Shulchan Aruch. At that time, closing in on the end of the Middle Ages, the Talmud was actually banned in Italy. I know that's shocking that a non-Jewish government would ban something Jewish. It's almost never happened in Jewish history, except when it happens all the time. And because his book was not considered the Talmud, his book was saved. It wasn't banned. And it was learned for about 2 centuries as the main source of learning in the Italian Jewish community. Now, I did not do any research whatsoever, but I think it might be an interesting idea for someone who's into Jewish history and wants to get a degree, to maybe do maybe it's been done, a doctoral thesis on the effect of the lack of Gemara availability in those 16th to 19th centuries, 16th to 18th centuries rather, of no Gemara, but having just Al-Fasi. What was it that what did it do? How did it change their course of their Masorah? It is interesting to note that the Siddur in Italy is not anything like you've seen. It's not Ashkenazi, it's not Sfaradi, it's Nusach Italki. It has its own Nusach. One of my daughters was in Italy a number of years back, bought a Siddur, and I have it's here on the shelf still. One day she'll take it, I guess. And the Nusach is very different. I mean, you can still recognize it's a Siddur and there's a certain order, but there are words and phrases and paragraphs and things that are not said at all, or said that are said that never saw it in Ashkenazi or Sfaradi Siddur. So there's one more man we have to talk about before the Rambam, and that's the Rosh. The Rosh is a man named Asher ben Yechiel, Rabbeinu Asher. The funny thing, in quotes, is that he's an Ashkenazi who became a major Sephardi posek. How did that happen? He's born in Cologne, in Germany, under the Holy Roman Empire, and which is Ashkenazi as you get. And again, he becomes a Sephardi posek. So I'll leave you a little bit in suspense We are not going to have class next week at all, any of my classes. My nephew's getting married, B'ezrat Hashem, Tuesday night. We have a lot of family coming in, so next week there'll be no classes at all. But I will let you know after that when we resume, probably the following week, B'ezrat Hashem. So you're going to have to be in suspense unless you want to look it up. Talk about the Rush and how he was also very influential in the growth of halacha and the understanding of the Talmud. And then we'll get together then, B'ezrat Hashem. In the meantime, have a wonderful day, evening, whatever it is. And just we should all hear B'sorot Tovot.